I've written 2 books on Cuba. My background is journalism, and I've been involved in Cuba for the last 22 years. First went down to Cuba as a tourist in 1986, as most Canadians do experience Cuba. I connected with Cuba more than just the beach. The Canadians go down, spend the week in Veradero on the beach, which is wonderful, but very few connect with Cuba other than that experience. Well, I got involved with the politics and started writing about Cuba, meeting the Cuban people, ended up marrying a Cuban. So really got connected with the country. Was involved with a number of commercial projects, and then started writing my first book, which was published 3 years ago, which I have here. It's called Voices from the Other Side, An Oral History of Terrorism Against Cuba. It's the first compilation of testimonies from average Cubans who have been personally victimized by this long unknown history of terrorism against Cuba, or that have had friends and family killed or been affected by these acts of terrorism that stretch back right from the early months of the triumph of the revolution up to and including very currently. As you may know, just yesterday the Cuban government arrested 4 Cuban Americans in Cuba that were planning acts of terrorism against military and government targets. So terrorism has always been an element of American policy against Cuba. It's an unknown policy. So that book came out 3 years ago. My latest book is called Cuba Under Siege, which we'll be talking mostly about this evening, and it was an offshoot of the first book. This examines how American policy in its totality, its strategy of regime change and its aggression against the Cuban government, how it's affected the Cuban revolutionary government's ability to protect itself and its citizens, the harmful effect it's had on Cuban society, on its economy, on its relations internally and internationally, and how it's affected the individual Cuban citizen. It's the first time that concept has been examined as well, and my perspective was that the Cuban government has had to do certain things in response to American aggression and American policy against Cuba. And again, very few people know the extent of just how many elements there are, and later I'm going to talk about the major elements of American policy of aggression against Cuba and what it means. And it has taken many forms. The economic embargo is probably the most recognizable. The terrorism, which I'll get into more specifically later. A military invasion at the Bay of Pigs in 1961. A planned second invasion in 1963, which led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Attempts to isolate Cuba, which has been very effective. Non-stop propaganda. And extraterritorial aspects of Cuban laws that have affected other countries, including Canada. So American policy in its totality has helped create this siege mentality among the Cuban leadership and its citizenship in order to protect the revolution. And that has led to certain internal policies, such as the surveillance programs that the Cubans have instituted to try and protect its citizens against these terrorist acts, and to determine who was in favor of the revolution and who was against it, particularly in the early years. The Cuban government is extremely sensitive to outside criticism, and that's in reaction to this nonstop propaganda they've had to face, all the misinformation and downright lies that the major mainstream media and the political elite have told about Cuba since the triumph of the revolution. The government has a low tolerance to who they classify as dissidents, and those are Cuban nationals living in Cuba that have accepted material or financial aid from the American government in support of American policies of regime change. The government has required a certain level of internal solidarity, and it has come at a social cost. And they've done that in order to defend itself against American aggression And it follows this age-old dictum that dates back 500 years. In a besieged castle, all dissent is treason. Cuba has had to spend precious resources to protect itself, far in advance of what a small nation needs. And these expenditures of resources has come at the expense of advancing their social programs and the ability of the government to improve its citizens' economic well-being. So what is Cuba's response to America's policy of aggression, its strategy of regime change? It's the response of any country throughout history that has faced national security threats or in time of war. Look at the United States after 9/11. Has American society opened or closed since that one day of terrorism? It's closed. There was less tolerance towards opposition. There was a demand for solidarity in response to America's invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. There was a reaction to a perceived threat from a very narrow segment of American society. All these responses are natural, are historic. Now you examine and you compare what a small country like Cuba, 11 million people, a tiny little country, how they've had to react to nonstop aggression from the world's greatest power that has made it publicly clear that the intent of their strategy is to destroy this country's social economic system. So the Cuban government has had to respond to that, and they've done it in a variety of ways. Now, not all of Cubans' problems can be laid on the doorstep of America's strategy of aggression and regime change. And if you've been to Cuba, you know the Cubans will talk about it. The Cubans love to talk, and they love to complain. And they will complain about their government shortcomings. But what they don't want is another country to impose its will. They want to figure it out on their own, and they're trying to figure it out with all the economic reforms that are taking place. But American aggression has had a very harmful effect and made it much more difficult for Cuba to advance itself, to implement these economic programs, to be successful, to achieve what the revolution wanted it to achieve. And it's very hard for an outsider who's not connected with Cuba like you are to understand that. It's easy to blame everything on the Cuban government and the system they have without taking into consideration the enormous influence and impact that American aggression has on this small country. So before I start talking about the individual aspects of America's aggression and the development of a siege, I do want to talk briefly about the history of Cuba, and I'm sure most, if not all of you know, but I think it's important to connect the historical aspects of Cuba-American relations. It makes it easier to understand why the Americans still have this obsession over Cuba. And this history goes back hundreds of years, back to the Monroe Doctrine of 1812, when the United States determined that Cuba had to be possessed in order to protect American security. It was felt this island was absolutely vital for American national security interests. Well, at that time, Cuba was part of the Spanish colonial system. The Americans tried to buy Cuba. They offered the Spanish hundreds of millions of dollars to basically purchase the island, and the Spanish said, thank you, no thank you. America's opportunity to control Cuba finally presented itself during the Cuban Second War of Independence, which started in 1895 under Jose Marti. For 3 years, the Cuban rebels were fighting the Spanish. And at the end of that 3 years, they were very close to winning their independence. They were finally moving towards getting rid of the Spanish. All this time, the Americans were looking at this very carefully and saying, okay, let's see what happens, because this could be our opportunity to take over the island, which happened in 1898 when the Americans came into the conflict ostensibly to help support the Cuban rebels to defeat the Spanish. And in 6 weeks after the Americans came in, the war was over. The Spanish were defeated. The Americans had an influence and an impact on ending the war, and the Cubans thought, that's great. We invited the Americans in, they came in, and they helped finish this war. So now we have our independence. This is what the Cubans were thinking. Now we have our independence. The Americans had a different thought. They said, okay, we came in, we won the war, and basically ignored the 3 years of what the Cuban rebels were doing. In the Treaty of Paris, there were two sides at the table, the Spanish and the Americans. The Americans prohibited the Cuban rebels to have any representation at the peace treaty talks. So it became pretty clear that the Cubans thought, wait a minute, the Americans didn't come in to help us kick out the Spanish. The Americans came in to replace the Spanish. And that's exactly what happened. For the next 3 years, in 1898 to 1902, the Americans established a military occupation of Cuba. And in that time, they were able to set up the systems in support of American economic and political interests. They basically blackmailed the Cubans, saying, your military occupation is going to maintain itself until you agree to these certain conditions. And that meant allowing American investment to come in and buy up Cuban land at rock bottom prices, for the Americans to set up a political system that was democratic in name only, that was entirely beholden to American influence. The Cubans could not do anything without the approval of the United States. And the most onerous part of it was the Americans established a set of rules that the Cubans had to agree to before the lifting of the military occupation. And that was the Platt Amendment. And if you're not familiar with it, Google it. It was the legislative method for America to establish hegemony over the Cuban island. The Cubans objected to it, they opposed it, but at the end they voted in the new Cuban Republic, which the Americans set up, voted in favor of it because they had no option. The Americans said, we'll keep the military occupation on as long as you want until you approve the Platt Amendment. Once the Platt Amendment was approved, that established in law America's economic, social, political dominance over the island. The Americans said, well, we're not colonizing Cuba. We haven't annexed them like Puerto Rico, but it was in name only, in everything but name only, a colonial imposition on Cuba. And that maintained itself for the next 60 years until 1959, under the dictatorship of Batista, that Fidel Castro and the boys came in, kicked out Batista, and the system. And just as a comment, Batista was the face, but he wasn't the reason. The reason for the revolution was to change the system. Batista was the dictatorship that was the end result of that system. Batista didn't make Cuba, but Cuba made Batista. And Fidel made it very clear that the revolution was against Batista, but it was against the system that brought Batista into reality, and that system was American owned and operated. So the revolution was against the United States of American interests in Cuba. And to this day, the American government has still not forgiven Cuba for that revolution, because they still don't understand why the revolution took place, because they still think, what was wrong with Cuba? It was a paradise. Everyone was happy. The Americans were making money. The Cubans were making money. Everything was wonderful because of American benign influence over this small, poor Caribbean country. So much of America's aggression and regime change strategy is based on that historical memory of not being able to understand what the revolution was all about and not being able to forgive Cuba for kicking them out. So there's been all these reasons why America has justified the continuation of embargo and aggression, but the actual reason is this lack of ability for the American government to understand and forgive. So the revolution triumphed January 1st, 1959. I'm not going to get into the tit for tat reaction. The Cubans the agrarian reform nationalized land. The Americans refused to accept compensation. The Americans ended the sugar quotas. The Cubans nationalized more land. That's going to be a debate that'll continue and will be resolved eventually. How? Who knows? The revolution established a new political, social, economic order in Cuba. And more importantly, it established Cuban nationalism for the very first time in its history, which was the reason the Cubans were fighting and the reason for the revolution, to change the system and to establish true Cuban nationalism, which it has. With all its shortcomings and faults, it's been a Cuban revolution made by Cubans for Cubans. In the early years of the revolution, from 1959 to 1965, the Americans set up the siege. They established the policies of aggression. They established the mentality of terrorism acts against the Cuban citizens. They established the economic embargo. They established the pressures on other countries not to trade with Cuba, and they were very successful about that. And so the first generation of Cubans who lived, who lived through that period have a different perspective of American policy against Cuba, because that was when it was established, and that was when it was at its worst, when the revolution was at its weakest, before it established its full relationships with the Soviet Union. The Americans put in place all these aspects of aggression, hostility, established the strategy of regime change. And so the first generation, the older Cubans who are still living in Cuba, remember those days and still perceive American aggression. The younger generation of Cubans, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, have a different perspective. They've lived under the revolution. They don't know anything else. They grew up under American aggression. They take it for granted. They've internalized it. And so for the younger generation, it's easier for them to blame the Cuban government on all the faults. To say, my economic problems, the social problems, whatever, are all the fault of the government, and don't take in consideration the continuing negative influence that American policy has against them. So it's quite an interesting dichotomy between the older generation, first generation revolutionaries who still understand and went through it, and the younger generation who don't know anything else but living under American aggression. So it's easy to not even take that in consideration. So let's talk about the different aspects of siege. The first one is the economic embargo. It's the most public, it's the most talked about, and it is the most it's the easiest aspect to determine the damage it's done, because it's done unbelievable amount of economic damage to the Cuban government and its ability to advance. It wasn't just an economic embargo at the start, but very early the Americans determined they were not going to sell arms, weapons to Cuba. So that, as well as the attempts at isolation, the ending of the sugar quota, helped drive Cuba into the Soviet Union sphere. When the American government says, we're not going to buy your sugar, and the Soviet Union said, we will, and we'll give you oil on top of that, and we'll sell you arms, and we'll have trade relations with you. Well, one side is kicking you in the head, and the other side is giving you a dollar bill. Which side are you going to go to? There are ideological components that led Cuba into the Soviet Union, but there were other aspects: safety, security, and trade and economics. You remember the first couple years, 59, 60, 61, Fidel really wanted to take a mid-approach. He wanted a non-aligned perspective on Cuba. The Americans wouldn't allow that. Their aggression, their intent to change, the regime change, their terrorism, their hostility helped drive Cuba into the arms of the Soviet Union in the late 60s, and then completely into the Soviet Union sphere of economic planning and social development in the 70s. The book, the Cuban Under Siege book, I spent a week at a children's hospital in Havana, the William Soler Hospital. It's very famous, in Alta Havana, near the airport. And I talked to the doctors, I talked to the parents. The economic embargo prohibits the Cuban government from purchasing certain medicines that the Americans still have patents on. The Cubans can buy generics from any other country in the world, and they can also buy certain medicines from the United States, but other medicines and other medical equipment is still restricted under the embargo. There are children dying because of those restrictions, and I talked to a number of parents who knew their children couldn't get the proper medicines and the proper care because the American embargo prohibited them from doing that. So one of the arguments of the anti-revolutionary side is, well, Cuba can trade with anything, any country in the world. They can get medicines from any other country in the world. To a certain extent, yes, but there are still restrictions. America still controls 90% of the international pharmaceutical patents. So there are still restrictions where the Cubans cannot get these medicines and this equipment, and it is causing the death of Cuban children. The embargo, one of the aspects is propaganda, and I'll talk about that in detail a little later. One of the propaganda aspects of the embargo is that the Americans have always said the embargo is not directed against the Cuban people, it's directed against the government. We don't want to give money to the government. We don't want to support the government. Well, it sounds somewhat reasonable if you want to take that line, but it's not true. The embargo is directed entirely against the Cuban citizenry. And the intent is to make them so miserable, to make them so economically deprived that they will rise up against their own government. And the American government has absolutely made it clear in statements that that is their policy. And I'm just going to read a couple quick quotes. In August 1960, Lester Mallory, the U.S. Department Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, wrote, "The majority of the Cuban people support Castro. There is no effective political opposition. The only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection and hardship. Every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba. A line of action which makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and the overthrow of the government. That is the reason why the embargo is in place." And in the 1970s, a CIA officer was asked, well, why is the embargo still on? Why is this hostility against Cuba still maintaining itself? And the officer explained, we wanted to keep bread out of the stores so the people would go hungry. We wanted to keep rationing in effect and keep leather out so people only got one pair of shoes every 18 months. And that mentality has maintained itself to this day. The economic embargo is to make sure that the Cuban people don't get enough food to eat or don't get enough clothes or don't have an economic opportunity, in the hope, after 50 years, that they'll finally rise up against their own government. Give it a few more years, they say. It'll take place. It'll happen. The Americans are nothing but patient. Terrorism. I spoke about it briefly. The first book I wrote covers it. There's been so many different aspects of terrorism. It started in the early months after the triumph of the revolution, when the American government determined that they will have this huge covert program to hurt the Cuban people and the government through acts of terrorism. The American government was directly involved through a program called Operation Mongoose that was developed after the Bay of Pigs in 1961 up into the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. It was responsible for hundreds of acts of terrorism causing the deaths of hundreds of Cuban civilians. It's been called the worst act of state-sponsored terrorism in the 20th century. One of the aspects was against the Cuban government's program to teach farmers and people in the countryside to read and write. It was called the Literacy Campaign. It started in 1961. The Cuban government arranged for thousands of Cuban students to go into the countryside to teach the farmers and the campesinos to read and write, to increase the literacy rates. Cuba has one of the highest literacy rates in the world right now, and it's because of that. More than a dozen Cuban student teachers, teenagers, were tortured and killed by anti-revolutionary Cubans still in country at that time. simply for teaching farmers to read and write. That's one of the chapters I covered in the book. The most infamous act of terrorism, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is the bombing of the Cubana Airlines in 1976. 73 people on board were killed, mostly Cubans, student athletes in Venezuela for a fencing tournament. The two Cuban-American masterminds, Luis Posada Carriles and Orlando Bosch, were tried. There's overwhelming evidence they were the masterminds. The two Venezuelans who planted the bombs both admitted that they were hired by Bosch and Carriles. Nothing has ever happened to either one of them, of the two Cuban Americans. Bosch died peacefully in Miami a few years ago. Luis Posada Carriles is still living in Miami. I can give you his address. You can go down there and say hello to him. The American government has never moved against him for his acts of terrorism. In 1997, there was a bombing campaign against Cuban hotels and tourist facilities. One Canadian-Italian, Fabio De Selmo, was killed. Dozens were injured. Posada Carriles bragged in a series of interviews in the New York Times that he was responsible for it. He hired these Salvadorians and others to plant these bombs in various hotels and tourist facilities. It was printed, it was established, the American government examined it, never came out saying it wasn't true, but didn't do anything about it. They let Posada Carriles come back into the country. He was charged 3 or 4 years ago with some minor immigration fraud. He's now living peacefully in Miami. The American government is hoping he'll die soon, so that'll end that problem. There was a psych-op terrorist program called Operation Peter Pan. Thousands of Cuban children were sent out of country on the fear that the Cuban government was going to take parental authority. It was a complete lie developed by the Catholic Church in conjunction with the CIA. About 20,000 Cuban children were sent out. Many infants sent from Cuba into the United States. A lot ended up in orphanages, halfway homes with strangers. Many were abused. There's some famous ones. Andy Garcia's a Peter Pan. But it was strictly a program to scare the heck out of the Cuban middle class who was nervous about what the government was doing in the first place. And it was very effective because it did scare thousands of middle-class Cubans to send their children away, and many never saw them again. One of the interviews I did, these are chapters from the book, one of the interviews I did was on a film documentarian called Marina Ochoa, who did a documentary on Peter Pan because she almost was one. Her brother was sent away to the States as a Peter Pan by her family, and she was next to go. She was about 10 at the time. She ran away from home for a week before she convinced her parents not to send her away. It was incredibly emotional, heart-wrenching, and still has affected the Cuban families to this day. In the 1980s, there was biological terrorism. Dengue 2 was introduced in Cuba. It's the most lethal form of dengue. It affects children mostly. 104 children died from it. Other biological terrorism included swine flu. There was 500,000 pigs that had to be destroyed because of the introduction of swine flu. And these diseases were absolutely unknown in Cuba prior. And in fact, a Cuban American, Eduardo Erosena, confessed in a courtroom in New York that he introduced, the CIA hired him to introduce a series of diseases into Cuba and biological strains, including dengue 2. The American government just denied everything. To this day, the Cuban government has to spend thousands of dollars spraying, especially Havana, every year to control dengue 2. One of the chapters talks about a woman who lost her younger daughter, one of the first victims of it, and her older daughter was affected by the disease at the exact same time. She had to bury her younger daughter and go to the hospital to comfort her older daughter, who had the same disease. Fortunately, the older daughter survived. All sorts of other incidents. There was a tiny village of Boca de Sama that was attacked. 2 people were killed, 8 were injured. It was done by the Cuban-American anti-revolutionary terrorist group Omega 7. They went back to Miami claiming they had scored this amazing military victory against the communist dictatorship, and it was a little village, 8 homes, 1 school, 1 store, and no military value. They just went in and shot up everything and everyone. And because of the terrorism, and I'll talk about that a little later, the Cuban government did their best to try and prevent further acts of terrorism. One of the ways was a surveillance program, which the government has been criticized for restricting civil rights. But it was a way to try and prevent further acts of terrorism within Cuba. The only other option the Cuban government has was to send Cuban intelligence agents into Miami to try and infiltrate these anti-revolutionary Cuban-American organizations that were conducting terrorist acts and were planning more. The Cuban government did that in the 90s. The result was these agents found information of future terrorist attacks. They reported back to the Cuban government. The Cuban government invited the American government to come in and study this information. The American government said, "Thank you very much," went back to Miami and arrested the Cuban agents, who we now know as the Cuban Five, and did nothing against the Cuban-American terrorist organizations. There's tremendous international recognition of the Cuban Five now. It's amazing how it has grown. I understand the Seattle group is very active as well. 2 are out, 3 left to go. So this is how the American government has perceived terrorism from a different perspective. Their war on terrorism included an invasion of 2 countries. Cuba's attempts to prevent terrorist acts resulted in the arrests of the Cuban intelligence agents. One of the aspects of American policy against Cuba in the early years was isolation. After the revolution triumphed, the Americans put tremendous pressure on every country in the Americas to stop trading with Cuba, to try and prevent the disease from spreading. And it was very effective. There was only 2 countries in the Americas that maintained relations with the revolutionary government: Mexico and
Chile?
Canada. To this day, the Canadian government, and we have had some pretty bad right-wing governments, have maintained relations with Cuba. But it was very effective. The rest of the Americas basically ended trade with Cuba overnight. As an example, from 1961 to 1963, approximately 350 ships from the free world stopped in Havana every year. By 1963, there were only 7. The Cubans obviously lost millions and millions of dollars in trade, and again, that had an influencing aspect on Cuba's move towards countries that would trade with them. When the Soviet Union said, "We'll pick up the trade in sugar and everything else," the Cubans naturally went to them. Propaganda has been an extremely effective tool in the American government arsenal against Cuba, and I'm going to give you 2 examples. Brothers to the Rescue, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. In the early 1990s, 94, 95, during the rafters crisis, when Fidel said to the Cubans, "If you want to leave, leave," thousands got on rafts to go to Miami. This was at the height of the special period when Cuba was suffering the worst aspects of the fall of the Soviet Union and the loss of so much of its economy. There was an organization in the United States called Brothers to the Rescue that were flying over the Straits of Florida to pick up these rafters. The head of Brothers to the Rescue was Jose Belsuto, which was a known terrorist. He bazookaed a ship in Miami Harbor in the 1960s. He was actually arrested for that. He was involved in other aspects of terrorism, and he was the head of Brothers to the Rescue. Once the rafter crisis ended with an agreement of immigration between the United States and Cuba, there were no Cubans getting onto these rafts, so there was no need for the Brothers to the Rescue organization to continue. That didn't stop Jose Belsuto. He started overflights over Havana, dropping leaflets, anti-government, anti-revolutionary leaflets. Every time he did it, the Cuban government protested to the United States and said, don't let him do this. He's invading our territory. He doesn't have permission. The American government wouldn't allow that. We're not going to allow that. They protested to the FAA, nothing happened. 12 times the Brothers to the Rescue illegally invaded the Cuban airspace over Havana. 12 times the Cuban government protested. The last time, Fidel said, if they come again, we're going to shoot them down. They came again. 2 of the 4 planes were shot down. 4 Cuban Americans were killed. Immediately, the response in the mainstream media and the political elite in the United States was, look how horrible the Cuban government is. They shot down these 4 unarmed civilian planes, and all they were doing was flying over Havana. At no time was there context. At no time was there anything in the media that said they'd been doing it for 2 years. 12 times the Cuban government protested, 12 times the Americans did nothing, and the Cuban government said the next time they do it, we're going to shoot them down. Nothing. So the average American and anyone else, including me when it first came out, it was like, oh my God, are the Cubans crazy? Why would they do that? Until you understand the background. A week after the shoot down, the FAA finally got around to suspending the license of the Brothers to the Rescue. A little late, but. The second incident of propaganda is the case of the American contractor Alan Gross, who was in Cuban jail. He was arrested 5 years ago for bringing in illegal high-tech communications equipment, including military equipment, BGANs, and SIMs. He had been to Cuba 4 or 5 times on a tourist visa. The Cuban government was watching him. When they arrested him, his story was, I was only trying to bring internet availability to the Cuban community in Havana. Well, the Cuban community in Havana said, we don't know this guy. We have all the internet we need, and he had nothing to do with us. Subsequently, it was determined that he was bringing in this electronic equipment to set up illegal, separate, private internet sites in Cuba beyond the acknowledgement of the Cuban government, and the implication was he would be able to communicate with anti-revolutionaries in Miami or anywhere with the potential of doing damage, terrorism, who knows. The equipment he was bringing in was not declared. The equipment he was bringing in is illegal. That equipment is illegal to bring into the United States. So the Cuban government arrested him and sentenced him to 15 years. Again, immediately after that, the mainstream media and the political elite said, the Cuban government's crazy again. They arrested this poor American. All he was doing, and these are direct quotes from the Miami Herald, all he was doing was bringing telephone equipment into Cuba. If you've ever been to Cuba, you know you can bring in telephone equipment. You may have to pay for it, but you can bring it in. What you can't bring in is illegal high-tech equipment for the purpose of setting up internet signals without the acknowledgement or the approval of the Cuban government. So again, the propaganda works in the way that the American media, mainstream media, has certain aspects and certain parameters where they say, this is how we treat Cuba. And I could give you dozens and dozens and dozens of more examples, and in fact, that's the topic of my next book, how the media has treated Cuba. Not just the American media, but the Canadian media, the international media, in promoting and propagating the anti-revolutionary propaganda that has been going on for the last 50 years. The goalpost, the American propaganda has moved the goalpost. They're experts at this. Why is the embargo still on? Why is the aggression still on? Why is the regime change strategy? Well, let's look at the reasons. The first reason was the Cubans nationalized American property. The Cubans offered compensation. The Americans denied it, refused to accept it. So that's why we have the embargo. So that's over. The embargo still continues. The Cubans were exporting revolution to Latin America. That's why we had to embargo Cuba. That ended. The embargo still continues. Then the Cubans went into Africa. That ended. Didn't change. Then for 30 years, the Cubans were puppets of the Soviet Union. Well, that ended in 1989. Did the embargo end? Did the aggression end? No. Now it's human rights. So the goalposts keep moving. When Cuba meets America demands, intentionally or not, the Americans shift the demand. So now if Alan Gross is apparently the obstruction towards communication and a move towards normalization of relations. If the Cuban government released Alan Gross unilaterally tomorrow, that wouldn't change a thing. What I spoke of before, those are the rationales to maintain the embargo and the aggression. The reason is the historical aspect, the loss, the inability to understand the revolution, the incapacity for forgiveness. That's the real reason, because the Americans don't want the Cuban government to reform. They don't want the Cuban government to move towards what they demand it move towards. They want the Cuban government, the revolution, to end. And so they can establish, in 21st century terms, the reimposition of American hegemony over the island. Currently, very quickly, there's extraterritorial aspects of Americans' aggression against Cuba. In the 1990s, as a result of the shoot-down of the Brothers to the Rescue, the American government passed the Helms-Burton Law. The Torricelli Act was passed a few years earlier. They were meant to increase the pressure on the Cuban government at a time when the special period was really harming the Cuban economy. So instead of the Americans having giving a helping hand to the Cubans, they said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get these new legislations to make things even worse, and that'll be the end of the government for sure. And part of the Helms-Burton Act prohibited American subsidiaries in third countries from doing business in Cuba. For example, McDonald's in Canada wanted to open a restaurant in Old Havana. Now we can debate the relative merits of McDonald's in Old Havana. The American McDonald's said, no, you don't. It's prohibited by American law. You can't go into Cuba. This is a Canadian entity, a Canadian legal entity that was being influenced by American law. And there are hundreds and hundreds of examples. Within a matter of 5 years, every subsidiary that was doing business in Cuba stopped doing business, and it cost the Cuban government millions and millions of dollars. So again, when people say, well, it's only between Cuba and the United States, Cuba can trade with the rest of the world. Yeah, they can, but there's all these other aspects that you have to look under to see. There's all these other companies that want to do business in Cuba, but they're not because they're prohibited by American law. There's companies in England and Ireland, whatever, that want to do business in Cuba, and they can't because of American law won't allow them to do it. Currently, Obama came in with expectations that he would change things with Cuba. He has done a couple things. He's allowed the Cuban Americans to travel back and forth to Cuba freely, and that's a huge move. The Cuban Americans are bringing a lot of money and a lot of material goods into Cuba. And he's expanded certain aspects of licensed travel for American citizens to go to Cuba. But the American tourist is still prohibited by law from visiting Cuba. So Obama's put a face on, well, look at what I've done. I've done these things that have been helpful to Cuba, and they have. Underneath that, he's done things that are a lot worse, even worse than what Bush was doing. He's made things a lot harder for the Cuban government to conduct normal international banking transactions. The Cuban governments are finding it really difficult for wire transfers from one country to another if it touches an American bank. So Obama has given the Treasury Department under OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Controls, expanded powers to go after Cuban wire transfers and the Cuban economy. Banks, international banks are being fined at a greater rate now for doing business with Cuba than they were under Bush. So the Cubans, you talk to Cuban officials, they're really feeling the pressure. Recently, the Cuban intersection in Washington had to shut down all of its services because the bank that they were dealing with could no longer provide those services. Again, because of the embargo, but also because Cuba is continuing to be designated as a state that sponsors terrorism. And just last week, Obama agreed and signed off on it for the next year. And that drives the Cubans nuts because they know the amount of terrorism that's been directed against them. And meanwhile, they find themselves still on this list from the State Department of states that sponsor terrorism, and it has economic consequences. Under that designation, that's why there's no bank that can find now that can offer consul services to the Cuban special interest section in Washington. So Cuban Americans are finding it harder to get into Cuba, and I'm assuming Americans with licensing are finding it more difficult. So Obama has made things a lot more difficult. He continues to maintain the Trading with the Enemy Act, which goes back to the 1960s, and that's the legislative justification for the embargo. The Trading with the Enemy Act was imposed in World War I and can only be enacted when the United States is in times of war or national security. Well, the Americans must think they're either at war with Cuba or that Cuba presents a national security threat, because Obama keeps re-signing and re-legislating the Trading with the Enemy Act. So the Cubans are saying, this is why we feel under siege. This is why we have to protect ourselves, because the Americans are maintaining this. And it's easy for the anti-revolutionaries to just ignore that, but it is law. The Helms-Burton Law specifically states the American government cannot normalize relations with Cuba until the Castros are no longer in power. So here's another country here's the United States of America telling another country, here's what your political system has to be. And to the point of, here's who we won't accept as leaders. And then the Americans say, no, we don't want to interfere with Cuba.
And the Helms is Jesse Helms.
Jesse Helms, the infamous Jesse Helms, who was the Republican, and Dan Burton, who was the Democrat. There was bipartisan throughout the last 50 years. There has always been bipartisan support for the embargo and the aggression and the policy of regime change. It's not Republican, it's not Democrat, it's both sides. We've talked about how Cuba has reacted. The economic reforms taking place under Raul Castro have been extensive and are continuing. The Americans have ignored it, although Hillary Clinton did give a nod to it a few months ago, but they haven't used that as a way to improve and move energy towards normalization. They've basically just said, yeah, the changes haven't been that important. Those changes are incredibly important. There's so many changes taking place in Havana right now and in Cuba, from the expansion of co-ops to the change in the laws for home sales, car sales. The Cuban government is moving towards 21st century socialism, and the American government is still stuck in 19th century imperialism. The future of the siege, where is it going to end? My opinion is, and I talk about it in the book, it's going to end in the same place where the siege has the strongest support, in southern Florida. The first generation Cubans lost the most from the revolution. They eventually have become the face of the embargo. The half a dozen Cuban American congressmen, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, the Diaz-Balart, Marco de Rubio, they are the ones who are making the noise to maintain the embargo. The rest of the United States could care less. The rest of Congress could basically care less, but they make the most noise, and they present themselves as the experts, and they present the reasons why the embargo has to continue. So the embargo does continue. But there's a demographic shift in South Florida, because the first generation anti-revolutionaries are dying out, and their influence is dying out. The new generation Cuban Americans that have come from Cuba into the United States in South Florida the last 20 years are the ones who are leaving for economic reasons, not for political reasons. So they have a different attitude towards their homeland. They want to go back and forth. They want to send money to their mother. They want to visit Cuba whenever they want. And they are starting to make their political noise known, because they are rejecting the hard right Cuban Americans who want to maintain the embargo, who do not promote engagement, who want to have nothing to do with interaction between the United States and Cuba. Eventually, my hope is those hard right Cuban Americans will be voted out, because the embargo is now in the hands of Congress. After the Brothers to the Rescue, after President Clinton, Democrat, signed the Helms-Burton Law, he codified the embargo into Congress. The President Obama, no president can eliminate the embargo. He could have done that up until 1994. Now the embargo has to be ended through a bill in Congress. And it's these Cuban-American congressmen that are preventing that from happening. So if the new generation of Cuban-Americans start voting for their interests, including the ability to go back and forth to Cuba and support the normalization of relations between the two countries, which they do, you may see a shift. You may see a shift in the political change. And there was an example that happened 2012. David Rivera, a Republican, hard-right Cuban-American, fully supporting the embargo and non-engagement, was running against Joe Garcia, a Democrat, who used to be all in favor of the embargo and now promoted his position of engagement and normalization. Rivera was the incumbent, Garcia was the opponent. Everyone expected David Rivera, the Republican, to win. He was the incumbent. He didn't. Joe Garcia won. He beat David Rivera. So now there is a more moderate voice, not the moderate voice we all hope for, but at least not extreme hard right. And Garcia has come out. Joe Garcia, the Democrat who won the seat, has come out and made statements about normalization of relations. There's a medical product called Herbapor that the Cubans developed to help diabetes victims. The Cubans are selling it around the world. Garcia said, this should be tested in the United States because I have constituents that may benefit from this. The rest of the hard right congressmen went nuts. Oh no, if it came from Cuba, we don't want anything with it. Garcia supported the introduction of the drug in the United States, and the majority in his riding approved and supported his position. Last month, 2 months ago, the Atlantic Council came out with a huge report saying the vast majority of Americans favor normalization, including Cuban Americans in Miami favor normalization and the ending of the embargo. One of the most important anti-revolutionaries, Alfonso Fanjul, who owned huge tracts of land in Cuba and sugarcane operations, he visited Cuba a few months ago and came out and said, yeah, I could see investing in Cuba in the future under the right conditions. And he lost a lot of land when Cuba nationalized. He came back to Miami, and the hard-right Cuban Americans went nuts because he represented such a strong position, anti-revolutionary. The rest of the Cuban Americans in Miami supported him. So you're seeing a shift in attitudes. As the old generations pass on, the new generations have a different attitude. And in Cuba, too. The first generation revolutionaries are going to be leaving us soon. And the new generation Cubans have a different attitude towards where they want to move their country. And there's a new generation of Cubans ready to take over. So in the near future, I think hopefully you'll see a shift, more importantly in South Florida, Miami, because that's where the embargo is still being held. You change that reality, you change the politics of the embargo. You let Congress pass a bill ending the embargo, or more importantly, ending the travel restrictions even before the embargo. That changes everything. When it will happen, who knows? How it will happen, who knows? But there are examples of it. The state governor in Florida, the ex-state governor, Charlie Crist, who was a Republican for the embargo, switched sides as a Democrat. He's against the embargo. So there's all these elements that are taking place that hopefully you'll see in the near future a change. And with that change will hopefully come the end of the embargo, the end of the travel restrictions and normalizations with relations, the ending of the punishment of the Cuban people, and the return to sanity of American policy against this small island. Thank you very much for your time.
The Interprint Service came out with a report saying the Floridians leave the U.S. in favoring normalization with Cuba, February the 12th actually. Apparently, they said that 63% of the respondents said that they would support normalization and greater engagement.
Well, I suspect that's a news agency reporting on the Atlantic councils. So Google Atlantic Council. You said February. That makes sense. It's been since Atlantic Council, which is neither right nor left. It's middle. They did an extensive report on America's attitudes towards Cuba, and that's exactly right. The majority of people in Florida, including Cuban Americans, including South Florida, favor normalization. It's not the first poll that has been done, but it's the latest, and it's been very influential. There was a lot of coverage, on that, and it just indicates the changing reality in the Cuban American community in South Florida. They're past the hostility. They want to deal with things today, not 50 years ago. And the Cuban government has changed its attitude as well. They, in the first few years, they had a very hostile relationship with the Cubans who left. Now, it's totally different. The more come, the better. The Cuban government last year, 2 years ago, ended all the bureaucratic procedures for Cubans required to leave the country. Now, Cubans can travel outside the country up to 2 years without losing any of their civil status. Which a lot have done for work, for visits, come back. The only thing they need is an entrance visa from the country they want to visit, which is normal procedure for anyone. The only one who's got travel restrictions against Cuba now is the United States. It's, you as average citizens, as tourists who want to go to Cuba, can't do it. You can, but you can't do it legally.
And in fact, the United States stops some Cubans from coming. Professor Vasallo is the latest that we're all familiar with because Cindy was organizing her tour.
Yeah, it still happens. I was at LASA, the Latin American Studies Association. They have a conference every year. Where was it? In San Francisco. And the American government just refused a number of Cubans to come up, which is so counterproductive because the Cubans that were going to come up are the Cubans who will talk about the good, the bad, and their voice is really important to hear. But yeah, that happens quite often, that Cubans are still prohibited, scientists or officials are prohibited from coming into the United States.
All right.